listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, joining us on the line from, as Ernesto Che Guevara used to say, from somewhere in the third world is Dr. Gerald Horne. And Dr. Gerald Horne is an African born in America historian who holds the John Jay and Rebecca Moore's chair of African American and world history at the University of Houston. And Mr. Horne, how are you doing today?
It's all good.
I guess we wanted to talk about the story that's breaking in the New York Times. Don Hung was he's still in the land of the living, but he was in the Liberal Party, and he was accused of collaborating with China, and he resigned from the Liberal Party and became an independent. We wanted to talk about that, but I checked all of I checked the Elizabeth May Green Party. I checked the head of the Communist Party, Elizabeth, not Elizabeth, but I got her name. I know her very well. Elizabeth Hill, I guess. And then I checked the Miguel Figueroa, who is one of the heads of the CP. I checked Barry Wise letter from who's leader of Socialist Action, and I came up with basically crickets. The last thing, besides this New York Times story, which is in the papers today, the last information about anything about him was 8 or 9 months ago. But let's go ahead.
Well, according to the New York Times, there is interference, their term, not mine, from the Chinese consulate in Toronto into Canadian internal affairs, including helping certain parliamentarians in Ottawa get elected. They pointed to a community called Markham, which they say has a substantial population of Chinese and Asian origin, and perhaps you folks can speak to that. But there is a larger question that I would like to address, and I would hope that Canadian progressives are thinking about this. That is to say, right now, Canada has very difficult relations with India as a result of this allegation that in British Columbia, an Indian agent had helped to liquidate a Sikh activist of some repute. Canada has difficult relations with China, not only because of the story we're discussing, but also because they collaborated with U.S. imperialism in detaining a leading executive of Huawei in British Columbia for a few years. And by the way, you know that in retaliation, apparently, China detained the two Michaels, as they were called, two Canadian citizens in China. And I understand that there are some recent revelations about one of the Michaels, if you know anything about that. And then finally, Canada has difficult relations with Russia because Canada has been quite hawkish with regard to the Ukraine question. We've talked about that at some length. The question of Chrystia Freeland, a close comrade of Prime Minister Trudeau, who's of right-wing Ukrainian vintage and heritage. And if Mr. Trump returns to power, which you cannot rule out by November 2024, less than a year from now, but actually being sworn in January 2025, it's probably likely that Canada will have difficult relations with the United States of America. And Canada, it seems to me, and I hope that this is recognized not only amongst progressives, but even in the Canadian ruling class, that Canada is rather vulnerable right now. It's a huge country with huge resources, but a population that's not larger than that of California, less than 40 million. It could be a sitting duck. The fact that it has complicated relations with the major powers, China, India, Russia, potentially the United States, makes it even more vulnerable. It reminds me of why Canada stuck to the British Empire for so long, particularly because of its vulnerability, and why you still, as I understand it, see you still have the fact that King Charles III is still paid homage in Canada. So I'm wondering what you folks' reaction is to all of this.
My reaction. Go ahead, Melinda. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, my question is that, like, to go back to Norman's point, where there hasn't really been talk about Chinese in the press, really, but it showed up all of a sudden in New York Times now. So that's just my question. My question is, like, why all of a sudden the New York Times is, like, picking up this story?
What is your speculation?
I don't know. I'm just curious of what that means, like, politically. Like, is it because they want to attach, like, certain forces want to attach, Trudeau to China? I don't know. Yeah, it's just a question and that I'm gonna put in the back of my head and maybe come back to it. But yeah, why is it?
I have some thoughts on it.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that
Jump in then.
Justin Trudeau is a fence setter, and he's trying to play both ends. He's always tried to play both ends against the middle. He wants to come down the third way, and I think that the Yankee, one section of the Yankee ruling class, wants him to be fully aboard with U.S. imperialism, and he's a fence sitter. And I think that is the problem. He's not. He won't take a public position supporting. I mean, he does take public positions, but I mean, he's not firm enough. They want him basically to come across as a hawk, straight no chaser. If you understand what I'm trying to say, Gerald.
Well, should we infer that if Mr. Trudeau is replaced by a Tory, that relations will improve with India, China, Russia?
Not necessarily, because I think India, China, and Russia have different. They have different lines. Like the relationship with India might be different from Russia, and so on and so forth. Because Kool Modi, the head of state of India, he's got his own plan. Mr. Putin has his own plan. And so I can't say that.
So what I'm trying to suggest is I think that Canada has a structural problem, setting aside the personalities, even magnetic personalities like Mr. Trudeau. The structural problem being it's a huge country with substantial resources, a relatively small population, and complicated relations with potentially its neighbor to the south, at a time when U.S. imperialism and world imperialism is headed for a major crisis. And it seems to me that makes Canada vulnerable. And it's something that I would hope that not only the Canadian ruling elite, I'm sure they must be thinking about that. I recall the white paper that we talked about on these airwaves some months ago from Madame Jolie, I think her name is, the Minister of External Relations. And she was warning about the coming to power of Mr. Trump and how that would lead to a flooding of U.S. refugees into Canada, one of which might be myself, by the way. So that's one of the reasons why I'm following this. So I take it that the ruling elements in Ottawa are thinking about some of these larger questions. I just hope that the left is not asleep at the switch. Because what oftentimes happens with left-wing forces, their ideology of being able to look around corners and over the horizon aside, is that oftentimes they assume that the status quo extends in perpetuity, which is ahistorical, anti-historical, and fundamentally doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think you used to quote this ever since I've known you. It's a situation almost where, if, like Curtis Mayfield would say, if there's hell below, we're all gonna go. It looks like we're almost in that type of situation, because the head of the Elizabeth Hill, I think her name is. I had problems with her, and I'm gonna be perfectly frank. She had more of a problem with me than I had with her, because we tried. They hired me a couple of times to speak, and she didn't want to pay. And the members of the organization, they basically said, this guy's not a professor. He's not cut the guy a little check, and eventually they did. So I think that there's a serious problem with the left in Canada. Serious problem.
Now, you were referring to the Green Party there, is that correct?
No, I'm referring to the Communist Party of Canada as well as the Green Party.
What about the NDP, which, as you know, has parliamentary seats in Ottawa?
The NDP is wishy-washy. The NDP is in Haiti. The NDP is they are they're trying to straddle the fence, and I think that Mr. Singh, who was Sikh or Sek, Melinda, I think Melinda could speak more on that.
My criticism of the NDP and Jagmeet and the NDP and the Orange is that they're relatively they're relatively quiet on anything foreign affairs. There's really no line, like you don't really know, and relatively, Jagmeet only speaks to what he's sure about. Like there's never any okay, let me take the Liberals to task, or Trudeau to task, or a conservative to task. It's always like, let's wait and see, and like what's the social media thing going on? You know what I mean? Like I feel like there's nothing, like there's never any opposition. So that's my criticism of the NDP in general.
Well, perhaps we can wrap up this point by raising a red flag, because, as I said, I don't think this problem of Canada's vulnerability is going away anytime soon. And as a person who has been contemplating exile in British Columbia, I would have to rethink if I don't see any more attention to these questions that are raised. Speaking of which, we talked last week, if I'm not mistaken, about the crisis between Guyana and Venezuela, with Venezuela having territorial claims against its neighbor. There is a referendum that's being pushed from Caracas with regard to the Essequibo, this oil-rich region. And given the fact that Venezuela's population is about 20 times the size of Guyana's, and given the fact that Guyana has internal contradictions, not least, I'm afraid to say, between many of African descent and many of South Asian descent, that's another part of the globe, speaking of Guyana in particular, that may be more vulnerable than many realize. And speaking of vulnerability, of course, grabbing headlines justifiably, is the ending of the pause or truce in historic Palestine. Bombing is continuing. Supposedly, it's leading to a crisis in relations between United States imperialism and Israel. And actually, there might be something to that, insofar as this fact that U.S. imperialism is supplying Israel militarily with these bunker-busting bombs of 1,000 pounds or more that are devastating Gaza, an area about the size of Manhattan. Obviously, the war criminals in Israel are not only seeking to kill many Palestinians in bloodthirsty revenge for what happened on October 7th, but they may have a more nefarious plan in mind in terms of depopulating that region as part of a land grab, and then, of course, moving on to depopulate further the West Bank, creating a so-called second Nakba, the first one, or catastrophe, taking place in 1947 and 1948, when the Zionists chased Palestinians from their homes in violation of international law, because even the United States put sanctions on Israel in 1949 because it was violating international law by not letting people return to their homes. And this is causing a crisis for U.S. imperialism. There's a boycott of U.S. corporations, companies like McDonald's. I saw a video in Istanbul, McDonald's, a protester unleashed mice into a McDonald's, sending the customers scurrying and hurrying away. Starbucks are sitting empty, not to mention the fact of reputational damage to U.S. imperialism. I had thought that his reputation was already rock bottom, but apparently I was mistaken. And then with regard to Southern Africa, we know that South Africa is pursuing a claim in the International Criminal Court against Israel. Palestine is a signatory to the ICC Charter, and perhaps the International Criminal Court will seek to rehabilitate its damaged reputation for going disproportionately after leaders in Africa by doing the right thing and going after Mr. Netanyahu. But South Africa's neighbor, speaking of Malawi, has moved to send thousands of Malawians, the flower of youth, to work in the fields of Israel, sending them to a war zone, believe it or not. I mean, can you think of anything more abominable than what the regime in Malawi is doing? And by the way, Melinda, I know you're a scriptwriter. Here's a potential idea. The founding father of Malawi, Hastings Banda, who matriculated in the United States of America, supposedly, when he returned, he did not speak any indigenous languages. And there has always been speculation either that he was not the real Hastings Banda who returned, or that somehow the United States was able to put a Black American into the ruling elite, actually ruling the country in Malawi. It would make an interesting Hollywood script if you want to tackle that. I should also mention that the Zionist lobby in the United States is really freaking out. I mean, we're all familiar with how, despite all this rhetoric about free speech in the United States, guaranteed under the Constitution, they're seeking to illegalize Students for Justice in Palestine on certain campuses in the state of Florida. Jewish Voices for Peace has been suspended at Columbia University. And we know, maybe we talked about this last week, I can't recall, that Elon Musk, born in apartheid South Africa, one of the richest individuals on planet Earth, owns Twitter, major shareholder in Twitter, or X, endorsing anti-Jewish posts, and then engaging in performative penance by going to Israel and breaking bread with Prime Minister Netanyahu. However, what's interesting is that in the Wall Street Journal, the Bible of the investor class, of the 1% in the United States, just a few days ago, a columnist was defending Elon Musk and attacking one of Elon Musk's major targets, which happens to be the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, which is a constituent element of the Israeli lobby in the United States. Interestingly, even though Elon Musk promised the ADL that he would make illegitimate the use of the term decolonization on his platform. You can't use decolonization on X or Twitter anymore because supposedly the Israelis don't like that. They think it has something to do with Palestinian rights. So he was trying to make concessions. Of course, the ADL, they took the bait because they don't want to cross a billionaire. But a Wall Street Journal columnist denounced the ADL in terms that were much more vehement and vitriolic than Elon Musk's terms, and then used a descriptor to affix to the ADL that's oftentimes only affixed to Black people. What is that descriptor, you ask? It's identitarian. Actually, this starts with our friends, our so-called friends on the left, when they want to dismiss Black self-determination, they call it identitarian or identity politics. So this is what he was using to describe the ADL. And I dare say that the Zionist lobby may be in deeper trouble than they realize when descriptors that are used to demean and degrade Black struggle is affixed to them. That means they're being grouped and categorized alongside the Negroes. And if you have been inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness, you do not want to be grouped and categorized with Black people. So this is part of this complex, fluid situation that we're facing in this country. And one more reason why I hope that in British Columbia, they keep the lights on for me.
Could I speak to two things you said? One, the question of Venezuela and Guyana. I have a good friend from Guyana, and he was telling me that the space that they're fighting over actually belongs to the Amerindians, and it's supposed to be like what do you call it? Like a holy sacred space. But I guess being the materialist trying to become the dialectical materialist that I'm hoping to be, that really doesn't. It's a question of who has the power, and I think the Venezuelans and the Guyanese are going to do battle, and I don't think that the Amerindians or the First Nations people of that territory are going to have anything to say about that. Secondly, I was listening to a talk show, and someone called in and was actually bigging up Hastings Banda. And as far as I know, Hastings Banda he was really probably instrumental in the death of Samori Michelle. And I think he is he's either a Jehovah's Witness or a Seventh-day Adventist. No, who sells a watchtower? That's the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Yeah,
I think
he is I mean, he's along with Mobutu and Shombe. I mean, he's on the wrong side of history. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, sure. I write about him in my Southern Africa book, and I also mention him because there's a man by the name of Leo Milas, Milas, who's a Black American who then poses as a Mozambican and rises to the highest level of Frelimo, the liberation movement. He's in my Southern Africa book as well. So apparently there was a stated policy of U.S. imperialism to get Black Americans to masquerade as Africans. Actually, Herb Boyd of Harlem, is writing about Milas and has written about him, if you want further detail beyond my book, because apparently he interacted with the man we know as Malcolm X when he traveled to Africa before his tragic slaying in February 1965. So this is something that we may have to rely upon the screenwriters and the novelists to address.
Hastings was it Hastings? I forgot his middle name. Yeah, but someone was actually talking about giving him props the other night on a talk show. We have about 5 minutes. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss?
Well, remember, I mentioned Ichiro, the outstanding outfielder, right fielder for the Seattle Mariners, one of the best baseball hitters of all time, Japanese ancestry. There was an article on him in both the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. When you see that sort of doubling up, it's probably because a publicist is involved. But I have to confess, I was very moved by the article because he's retired now. He's in his 50s, but he loves playing baseball. So now he organized a team in Japan that plays teenage girls' baseball teams. And one of the things he said in that article, in these articles, is something that we all should remember. When he was asked why he was still playing and why he was recruiting people his age to play, he says that it's not how well you play, it's how dedicated you are. And that's something I agree with, that it's not as if you can be as revolutionary as you want to be, although hopefully you will be and can be. The question really becomes, how dedicated are you? How willing are you to put in the time? How disciplined are you? So shout out to Ichiro. And by the way, he had one of the strongest and most accurate arms. I mean, be able to throw a baseball in a line drive fashion from the deepest corner of right field all the way to third base, all the way to home plate, oftentimes without a bounce, a bullet, an amazing athlete.
Let me say this, Dr. Horne. I remember sitting in a barbershop in Toronto, Canada, and there was a big argument about who was the greatest right fielder of all time. And the discussion went like this. The baddest is Vladimir Guerrero, Sr. The brother from Jamaica jumped up and says, nope, baddest is Ichiro. He says Vladimir could throw a ball to China, but it wouldn't be accurate, whereas Ichiro was always accurate. He basically said the same thing that you just said. He said Ichiro, hands down, Ichiro was the baddest, you know.
And speaking of which, Shohei Ohtani, who could justifiably be characterized as the greatest baseball player of all time and still with us. Period. He may be coming to Toronto. And because of his arm operation, he won't be pitching next year, but he'll still be hitting as a designated hitter. And what's the scuttlebutt with regard to Ohtani coming to Toronto Blue Jays?
I haven't been following baseball like I should. I used to follow baseball like it was like, what did Duke Ellington say? Music is my mistress. Baseball was my mistress. But I'm going to start following that situation. In fact, I'm going to start going back to me and Melinda promised to start going to some baseball games.
Oh, right on.
Yeah, because I'm going to go if you go to a baseball game in Toronto, last time I went to a baseball game, there was nothing but older Euro-Americans and Latinos. You would have to speak Spanish. There would be so many people from Venezuela in the stands in Toronto.
Mm.
You know, the Latin community loves baseball, but in our the Caribbean folks, it's soccer and cricket as opposed to and basketball, pardon me, and football too. But baseball is our people of African origins. I think we talked about that. We're losing out on that, I believe.
Mm. Well, I know time's expiring, so let me conclude by mentioning that the book signing, book launching conversation, Los Angeles, Leimert Park, otherwise known as Africatown, on Saturday, February 3rd, 1 to 3 Pacific, LA time, Los Angeles time. It's posted on my Facebook page, my Instagram. Norman, you have a copy. I hope you and Melinda can post it. And make sure that your relatives and comrades are shepherded to this event on February 3rd.
Yeah, my cousin Donald Williams says he will be there with his red suit on. He's definitely coming in because he's bought all of your books. He was basically he was. Yeah, I told him about it the other day. He said he would be there without a doubt.
Right on.
All right. Anything you want to add, Linda?
No, we ran out of time, so we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
Good luck to you.